And tonight we're thinking about this question of mistakes and mistreatment. How can we forgive? How can we forgive? I wonder if you've heard the name Justine Sacco. Anyone heard of her name? She became kind of famous, or maybe infamous would be the words, just under 10 years ago. She is what many people say the first victim of public shaming or cancel culture. She was working for a large firm in New York. She was traveling on holiday to South Africa. She was transferring in London's Heathrow Airport. And during her time at Heathrow, she tweeted a joke that was construed later on by many people as racist. She only had 170 followers on Twitter, and she thought nothing of it. She got on the plane, 12 hours later, landed in Cape Town. What she didn't realize is that while she was in the air and out of phone connection, her tweets had become the #1 trending thing on Twitter. In the time that she was in the air, everybody in the world was talking about how racist she was. During the time she was in the air, she was in the process of losing her job and her career. One tweet, and that was it. And that, in many ways, was the beginning of similar instances that have played out, haven't they, over the last decade or so. Just last summer, Ollie Robinson made his debut for England at cricket. And after a pretty decent first day's performance, it was released to the media some tweets that he had made 9 years previous as a teenager. His career came to a stuttering halt as he was then banned for 8 matches. And John Ronson, a journalist, has written a fascinating book about these instances called So You've Been Publicly Shamed, where he tracks what has happened again and again to many people in the social media world. And I don't know how you feel when you hear stories like that. I guess we maybe feel torn. Part of us feels uncomfortable, maybe, with the fact that a tweet from someone's teenage years can mean that their whole career and life becomes defined and their future can be cancelled. But on the other hand, part of us wants to say, but racism is wrong. Sexism is wrong. And we can't tolerate things like this. How do we hold those things together? And more to the point, how do we get here? I don't know if you've come across this book by Jonathan Haidt. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind. He co-authored it with a guy called Greg Lukianoff. And in it, he looks at 3 ideas which he says have actually infiltrated the way we so often think in Western culture. 3 ideas that have come about with good intentions, but are actually having harmful consequences. And one of those ideas that he talks about is this, if we can put it up. He talks about the untruth of us versus them. Life is a battle between good people and evil people. He's not denying the reality that there is such a thing as good and evil. But he says what we often do is simplistically divide the world into individuals and groups who could be classed as good, or people or groups who are classed as evil. And the way we change the world or make the world a better place is to call out the evil people, to cancel the evil people, to get rid of them. And he says, actually, that is too simplistic a way of looking at it. In fact, that idea of simplistically dividing the world into groups like that is an idea that has come about before. I wonder if you've heard of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. His book, The Gulag Archipelago, is a fascinating book, although it will take you 24 hours to listen to the abridged edition on Audible. So that was one thing I did during lockdown. But Alexander Solzhenitsyn is a fascinating guy. He suffered during the Soviet system in the gulags, the concentration camps of the Soviet system. And it was particularly personal for me reading his account of that system because my own great-grandparents on my father's side died in the same gulags. And what he says is that actually the system that came about was a system that was designed to try and cleanse, to purify, to make better society. But what happened was that certain individuals, certain groups were classed as evil, wrong, the oppressors. And society was to get rid of them so that society could move on and become a better place. In that system, you were guilty not so much necessarily for what you had done, but for who you were associated with. And I find it very fascinating because here is Solzhenitsyn suffering in the gulag at the hands of an evil system, and yet what does he say? Does he just give a political expose of this system and say what we need is a different political system? No, he does something even more profound. Listen to what he says. He says this: if only it was so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? He's saying, actually, the problem with the world is not certain groups or political systems. The problem with the world is not just people out there. The problem is also in here. Good and evil exist, and they exist in every human heart. It's too simplistic to divide the world into good and evil, because we find both in ourselves. And that's something we've been having to confront and wrestle with in recent years, isn't it? A couple of years ago, there was a lot of talk about statues and people talking about whether or not certain statues should be allowed to stand. Very famously, of course, the statue of the slave trader in Bristol was torn down unceremoniously and dumped in the harbour. And that created all sorts of questions about other statues and memorials. And a very interesting question was raised. Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, had unveiled a statue of this lady, Millicent Fawcett, just, I think, a year or so before. Millicent Fawcett, one of the suffragettes, commemorated rightly for the way that she fought for women's equality. But as someone pointed out, Millicent Fawcett was also, in some of her views, deeply racist. In fact, indirectly responsible for the deaths of many people in the Boer War. So should we celebrate a woman like that, who in one area of life was a hero, but in another was a villain? How do we make sense of things like that? Because what Solzhenitsyn is saying is that it is too simple, isn't it, to simply point the finger? Because actually, what if there's problems not just out there, but also problems in here? Last night I quoted from this book by Sally Rooney. If you'll forgive me for quoting it twice, it was just a very interesting book, and I read it a couple of weeks ago, so it's still fresh in my mind. But in this book, one of the characters is wrestling with this question of forgiveness. And she, very interestingly, puts it this way. She says, at the moment, the cycle of insincere public apologies is making everyone suspicious of forgiveness. But what should people who have done terrible things in the past actually do? Spontaneously advertise their own sins in order to preempt public exposure? Just try never to accomplish anything that might bring them increased scrutiny of any kind? Maybe I'm wrong, but I believe the number of people who've done seriously bad things is not insignificant. I mean, honestly, I think if every man who had ever behaved somewhat poorly in a sexual context dropped dead tomorrow, there'd be like 11 men left alive. And it's not only men, it's women too, and children, everyone. I suppose what I mean is, what if it's not only a small number of evil people who are out there waiting for their bad deeds to be exposed? What if it's all of us? What if it's all of us? And what if our pointing the finger, or what if our calling out is partly a defense mechanism of trying to prevent people from seeing the stuff that's also in our own lives and on our own past? Fascinating question. Well, I want us to look tonight at a segment from the account of Jesus' life that's on our tables. You can read it, if you want, from the Uncovered books. It's on page 32. Or if there aren't enough to go around, there's also the little slip of paper on the tables as well with the text printed. Because we'll see here a group of people who are doing potentially exactly that. Calling out the evils of others in an attempt, perhaps, to cover up the evils in their own lives. It's an encounter that Jesus has with a group of people called the Pharisees. They were the religious elite, the religious leaders of Jesus' day. And we can see by their attitude, you'll see in a moment, that they are very hostile to Jesus. By the way, if you today have considered writing off the Christian faith because you don't like the hypocrisy of religious leaders, It's a great encouragement, perhaps, to you to know that the people who were most antagonistic towards Jesus himself were hypocritical religious leaders. But let's look at what happens. It starts like this. The Pharisees and some teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You've let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions." And he continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and anyone who curses their father and mother is to be put to death. But if you say that anyone who declares what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is, devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that." Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it's what comes out of a person that defiles them." After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach and then out of their body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it's from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person." Well, what's going on there? Maybe to our 21st century ears, this sounds rather strange because it's dealing with customs and cultures that we're unfamiliar with. At first, it seems rather strange that Jesus seems to be defending the fact that his disciples aren't washing their hands. I mean, like, if there is one thing we've learned in the last 2 years, it's probably a good idea to wash your hands. And Jesus is not denying that. But what he is doing is he's talking not about the hygienic purpose of washing one's hands, but a ritualistic purpose that these Pharisees were going through. These Pharisees would go through elaborate rituals to try and show how outwardly they were clean, how they were okay, how they were acceptable. It was basically a way of virtue signaling their goodness to the rest of society. And Jesus says you do a really good way of virtue signaling your goodness while at the same time hiding the stuff that really goes on inside your own hearts. And then he talks about this practice of devoting stuff to, called korban. If you are from an Arabic-speaking culture, you'll know that that word is the same in Arabic as in Hebrew. And basically what was happening is that although they knew that the law of God in the Old Testament said that they were to honor their parents, they could get away with not using their money to help their parents by devoting their money to God. And then they had to say to their parents, "Well, I'm sorry, I can't give you anything because all my money is devoted to God." And then, of course, once their parents had died, they had a very helpful way of undevoting their money to God so they could use it for themselves. Ways of getting around the religious rules and the commands of God so they didn't have to do what God wanted them to do. And Jesus says, look, here you are, virtue signaling your goodness, calling out the sins of others, insisting that they're cancelled, and inside, you don't care anything about your own parents, you hypocrites. And then he goes on to talk about what really makes us unclean. He says it's not the stuff that comes from the outside that just goes into your stomach and out of your body. It's what comes out of you that really makes you unclean. The problem of evil is not just external, but it's internal. And it's internal to each one of us. And he concludes by saying to his own followers, just look again at the end, it's from within, verse 21, out of a person's heart the evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. By the way, what makes that list so shocking is that there are some things that I would never think twice about, along with things that I would never think about. Look down that list. There's stuff that maybe makes us all squirm, isn't there? And Jesus says that's the problem. It comes from within. It comes from outside of all of us. And maybe our desire to point the finger, to cast stones, to call out, is a way of stopping ourselves from having to confront the uncomfortable reality of what's on the inside, what's going on in each one of us. I mentioned John Ronson in that fascinating book, You've Been Publicly Shamed. And I was really struck by something he said in the conclusion to that book. He says this: the powerful, crazy, cruel people I usually write about tend to be in far off places. But I came to this uncomfortable conclusion that the powerful, crazy, cruel people were now us. For years, I've been writing stories about people abusing their power. When the people abusing their power were over there in the military or in the pharmaceutical industry, everyone loved it. But as soon as I wrote that we were the ones abusing our power, people were saying that I must be a racist too. He says it's very easy to talk about the evil out there, but he says, actually, what if we're also responsible? It's uncomfortable though, isn't it? And it's hard to admit maybe our own failings. I don't know if you've like following this guy, Martin Lewis. Apparently Martin Lewis, money-saving expert Martin Lewis, is the most trusted man in Britain. Do you know that? So certainly, maybe I was thinking maybe he should become a politician, but then maybe he shouldn't, because that would certainly go down the moment he got elected. But Martin Lewis, very trusted guy, he put out a really fascinating Twitter poll. He basically was asking people, do you think that people in Britain today are generally honest and decent? And then alongside that, there was another poll asking the same people, do you think that you are generally decent and honest? And he came to a fascinating realization. He said this: so far in this poll, 95% of people believe that they are decent and generally honest. Yet only 16% of people in my earlier poll believe that only over 90% of other people are. So either we're overinflating our own goodness or underappreciating it in others. Fascinating. Either we're overinflating our own goodness but underappreciating it in others. Someone else who came to the same conclusion is a guy called Daniel Kahneman. His book, Thinking, Fast and Slow, is basically his popularization of his work that won a Nobel Prize in economics. But in one psychological experiment that he examines, he notes how people are far more likely to think well of themselves than they are to think well of others. And he comes to this conclusion. He says, we can have it up. If we can have it up. I can't remember what he says. We'll need to have it up. What did he say? No. No, he didn't say Millicent Fawcett. There it is. He said, changing one's mind about human nature is hard work. Changing one's mind for the worse about oneself is even harder. It's even harder. It's uncomfortable, isn't it, to face up to our own failings. But have you ever thought why? Well, I guess on the one hand, it's always been hard. Like, no one likes to face up to their own failings. It's always easier to talk about other people's. But I wonder whether it's particularly hard for us today in a way that maybe it hasn't been for other cultures. And my reason for suggesting that is, although we live in a society that talks a lot about tolerance, we don't necessarily talk a lot about forgiveness, do we? And in a culture where you can be cancelled for stuff that you said 10 years ago, why would you ever want to admit your failings? You'd be forgiven for wanting to hide them away as deep as possible and never let them be seen. Because what might happen to you if people see the reality about you? Much safer to point out the failings of others as a form of distraction. It's hard to admit your failings if there is no forgiveness. And by the way, that's why I think the Christian faith is so beautiful. Because at the heart of the Christian faith, at the very center, is this message of forgiveness. A message of a God who was willing to come and forgive us. And actually, it's at the very heart of the Christian story. That God would come in the form of Jesus, and he would live, but not just live, but die. And through his excruciating, painful death on a Roman cross, he would take upon himself the shame that we should experience, the guilt that we have, so that we can be forgiven, so that our guilt can be taken away, so that our shame can be removed, so that we can be forgiven. It's a beautiful message. But I was chatting to someone the other day and they said, hang on a minute though. But why did God have to do all of that? You know, if God's God, he could just forgive, couldn't he? Why all this elaborate story of getting born into history and dying on a cross? Why does God need to do that? God's God, he could just forgive. To which I want to ask this question: does anyone just forgive? If something's really serious, do you just forgive? I'm not saying that forgiveness is impossible, but it's not easy, is it? Particularly if you've been really hurt. And forgiveness is different to tolerance. The difference between these two things came home to me a few years ago in a rather amusing way. I was working for a church down on the south coast in a place called Bournemouth, and I remember one Sunday I came out of church and this older lady came up to me and she said, Michael, I don't think your clothes are very well ironed. And I said to this lady, I said, that's because they're not ironed. And she said, well, I would like to do your ironing for you. I said, well, that's very nice. Thank you very much, but I'm okay. But every week she came up to me and she kept pestering me to do my ironing. And so eventually I thought the only way to get her off my case was to agree. So we came up with a deal where I would do my washing, and then I would drive the washing across town, let her do the ironing, and then the next day I would drive across town and pick up the ironed clothes and take it home and so on. And I was spending about an hour and a half of my week driving across town with my clothes to let her do my ironing. And this arrangement had been going on for a few months. And then there was one particularly busy week where I had dropped off the clothes, but I was too busy to go and pick them up the next day. So she phoned me up and she said, don't worry, I will leave your clothes in the church office and you can pick them up tomorrow. So I thought, great. So next day I thought I'd better go and pick up my clothes. I'm kind of running out of things to wear. And so I went into the church office, couldn't find them. So I went downstairs and found the secretary and I said, have you seen my clothes? And she's like, why would I have seen your clothes? I'm like, I had to explain the arrangements. And she said, well, I haven't seen your clothes. So I phone up this lady and I say, have you, what did you do with my clothes? Like, I can't find them. She says, oh, I left them with Muriel. Now, that doesn't mean anything to you, but to me, I got a bit worried at this point because Muriel was the lady that ran the homeless outreach. And so I went down to see Muriel in the Centre for Homeless Outreach and I said, Muriel, have you seen my ironing? And there was this horrible moment where the metaphorical penny dropped in Muriel's mind and she realized what she had just done. And she said, oh, I'm very sorry, you're going to have to come and see. So I went into the storeroom where all the clothes were kept for being given away. And the only items of my clothes that hadn't been taken by the homeless were my pajamas and a t-shirt that was obviously so bad that even the homeless didn't want it. But everything else had been taken. And for weeks I was finding people across town wearing my clothes. And I kind of wanted to ask for them back, but then I thought it looks really dodgy, doesn't it, when you're asking homeless people for their clothes. Anyway, I was really upset about this. So I said to Muriel, I said, like, why did you give away my clothes? And she says, it's not my fault, it's Barbara's fault. She knew that I ran this homeless outreach. She shouldn't give me your clothes. So I phoned up Barbara and I said, Barbara, why did you give Muriel my clothes? She says, well, it's Muriel's fault. She knew they were for you. I told her. So Barbara blamed Muriel and Muriel blamed Barbara, and this went on for a while. And eventually I'm on the phone to Barbara, and she says, well, Michael, I'm sorry. And I thought to myself, this is the moment where I say to her, well, don't worry about it, it's fine. But I couldn't. I was so upset that she'd given away my clothes. Oh, I just can't say that. So I'm thinking, what should I say? What should I say? I couldn't think of anything to say. So literally all I did was I put the phone down. But then I felt really bad because I was like, oh, man, I shouldn't have done that. So I phoned up my mate and explained what had happened. And he thought this was very funny, just as you do. I said, what should I have done? She said that she was sorry. I felt like I should say it was okay, but I couldn't say it was okay. But what should I say? I'll never forget what he said. He said, you should have said, if you're willing, I forgive you. And for the first time in my life, I realized the difference between forgiveness and tolerance. Tolerance is when we say to someone, it's okay. And we can say that when things aren't really that serious. And by the way, giving away someone's clothes isn't really that serious in the grand scheme of things. But if it really hurts, we cannot say it's okay. But when we forgive, we're actually saying something different, aren't we? We're saying it's not okay, but I'm not going to make you pay. And the Bible never says that God tolerates our world. And I'm glad about that. Because when I look at our world with its inequality and its injustice and its racism and its sexism, it's not okay, is it? And God doesn't say it's okay. But also when God looks at my life and yours and he sees the stuff in our lives, if we're honest, there's stuff in our lives that's not okay either, is there? And God's not going to say it's okay, but wonderfully, because of Jesus, God can say something else. He can say it's not okay, but I'm not going to make you pay. Because I paid. I took the consequences of what you have done so that you can be forgiven. No one just forgives. And God didn't just forgive, it was costly. But he is willing to forgive, and he's willing to forgive us. And that's a beautiful thing. Because it means we can come clean. We don't have to hide away. Because this God knows the worst about us and he loves us. And he wants to give us that fresh start. And also, let me just throw out two other things. Number one, if you've experienced that forgiveness, it also enables you to forgive others. Because you know that the God of the universe has seen the worst about you and yet is willing to forgive you. And the experience of being forgiven actually helps you forgive others. It's not easy, but it's easier when you've had to realize that you need it yourself. And also, if the Christian community is a community of people who have experienced the forgiveness of God, that should make it a wonderful place to be. Because actually, the number one thing for becoming a Christian is not to say, I'm pretty good and I'm better than you, and that's why I'm in. It's actually to say, I'm no better than you. I need forgiveness, and I've received it in Jesus. It should be a place where we can be honest. Because actually, sometimes it's only when we're honest about our failings that we can first receive forgiveness, but also, secondly, we can change. We're never going to be able to change to become the people we want to be if we're never able to be honest about the people we currently are. And at the heart of the Christian faith says there is opportunity for forgiveness. Now you might be saying, well, how does this look in practice? All very well in theory. Well, let's hear from someone now. We hope that she'll be here, but unfortunately she's in isolation, probably watching right now. So this morning on Zoom, I chatted to Jess. And I asked her how this story has made a difference for her life. So hopefully we'll be able to watch that now. Oh dear. Well, it is great this evening to be joined by Jess. Well, unfortunately not in person, but on our computer screen. So Jess, tell us, where are you right now?
Hi, I'm actually just in my room at Cats. Unfortunately, I've been hit with COVID this week, so it's really sad that I can't be there in person to join you all. But yeah, thank you for having me here tonight.
Well, we're glad that you can join us in this way, and all the other people who are watching from isolation will now feel identified with, because even the people presenting tonight are not all there in person. So you're with us. Jess, give us your stats. I think that's the terminology, isn't it, in Cambridge, to introduce oneself. What are your stats?
Yeah, so I'm a first year geographer, as I mentioned at Cats, and I'm also an athlete. So I do athletics. I mainly run 100 meters, 200 meters, and yeah.
Great. And you run the 100 meters quite fast, don't you? What's your fastest time? Well, fast for me. I mean, I'm flat-footed, so I think anyone who can run 100 meters at all is doing really well, but you can do it quite well.
From a few years ago, I ran 13.1, but yeah, been through the ups and downs of sport, to injury, to everything. So yeah, we're getting there again.
Brilliant. How are you enjoying Cambridge?
Yeah, Cambridge has been really good. I don't know, like I think coming in, I didn't really know what my expectations were, but whatever expectations I had, like, they definitely been exceeded. It's been an amazing time. So yeah.
Fantastic. Now, as people have probably guessed, you're obviously a Christian, you're part of the Christian Union, you'd normally be at things like this if you were in isolation. Um, but that's not always been the case. How did you first kind of start to investigate Christianity seriously for yourself, and tell us your story?
Yeah, so I actually didn't grow up in a Christian home. I didn't really grow up in any faith. I sort of wasn't pushed into one. I wasn't told to shy away from any. I sort of just grew up just like as any normal child would, going to primary school. And I guess I had like the church influence there. We had a vicar come in sort of every week, give an assembly. We went to church, school, during Christmas, during Easter, and those sort of times. But yeah, growing up, I knew about Jesus. I knew that, he was born at Christmas, he died at Easter. I almost at times thought that I was a Christian just because I knew these things, but it wasn't until like friends couldn't come to my birthday parties on a Sunday because they were at church that I still questioned like, hi, am I actually a Christian? Like, what do I actually believe? And yeah, throughout school, I never really questioned much about it. Went into secondary school, like life was fine. I sort of just see life as normal as it probably was for most people. Um, and it wasn't until around year 9 or 10, I'd say, that that was when I started questioning like, who I wanted to be. Just because that's a time when people around me started changing and going down certain paths in certain ways that just didn't sit right with me. It made me really think about who I wanted to be myself and who I was really basically like searching for, who I wanted to go down in life. And yeah, I'd say that was a real moment for me that made me start looking into the Christian faith, I guess because I had that basis of growing up knowing about Jesus. But yeah, after just like reading the Bible and looking into faith a bit more, it just made me realize that there was sort of this mirror held up in front of me of the pursuit of people around me, which is what I was also searching for, I guess, at that time in life. That those are certain things that I felt defined me, my grades, my lifestyle, my choices, because especially being in an academic school, I think that's what everyone around me was searching for. And yeah, just realizing that I wasn't defined by that. I was defined by a God that loved me, just gave me so much more worth in that. And knowing that I could have never deserved that, like the fact that God loves every part of us, even though every part of us wanted to reject him, wanted to turn away from him. It's just an incredible love that we could never find in this world and in our pursuit of anything else, really. And that really made me just realize, yeah, maybe this is something worth pursuing in life instead of all these other things. And yeah, we're loved by a father like who wants this relationship with us, even amongst every wrong thing we've done. And we can know in this world it's so hard to forgive things that we've done just on a daily basis. Yet everything in our life and everything that we will do in our lives is going to be forgiven by someone who could not sin. And yet, Jesus still came down and died for us. And it's just such an incredible truth that I couldn't turn away from, I guess. And yeah, it's been incredible since then.
That's amazing, because we've been thinking today about this pursuit of perfect, and so often, like, we can feel we're defined by our failures or our inability to live up to that perfect standard. But what you're saying is basically, in Jesus, we're accepted not because we're perfect, but because of what He's done, and that gives us that security. Just thinking about what that feels like, what does that? How does that change the way, particularly, you go about being an athlete, a student at Cambridge? How does knowing that truth change the way you live day to day?
Yeah, it really changes my perspective of how I look at, again, academic things and everything I get up to in my life. It's not the be all and end all of everything, that it's not perfect. Like, we always try and reach this standard of perfect, yet Jesus is a perfection we could have never found in anything in this world. And, that's why um, there is a love so much greater in Him than anything we could find. And yeah, it just means that I don't have this pressure on myself to know that it is all down to me to go and like save myself, because I could have never done that. Um, and in our work and knowing that, yeah, this essay isn't going to define us, and this super, even if it goes badly, isn't going to be like the end of the world. It's just such a security and a hope that we can have. And yeah, as an athlete, it just means I can have this grace on myself in the times when I don't reach the standards that I'm trying to reach. There's such a culture in sport, especially athletics, because it's so individual, that we can get so frustrated at ourselves and be so caught up in this whirlwind of we're trying to reach the right like body type or right try and reach the right like eating standards and everything. But it just doesn't define us in the way that God defines us, which is, yeah, by who He says we are.
Yes, that's so helpful. Thank you so much for joining us, sharing a bit of your story. We hope that you're out of isolation soon, back in circulation. But thanks so much. That's really, really helpful.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to Jess. And if you want to chat to her and you're online, I think she'll be in the Zoom room later. So incentive to join that. But isn't it great to hear the difference this makes? Knowing the freedom of forgiveness, the freedom that we can be ourselves, the freedom that we don't have to be perfect, the freedom that comes from knowing there's a God who accepts us. And I wonder, have you ever experienced that yourself? Is that something you're still looking into from the outside, considering for yourself? Is it something you'd like to experience? Well, I'd love to explain how you could experience that for yourself. Before that, to help us maybe reflect on all the stuff that we've been thinking about today, Anna's going to come and give to us a spoken word. So please welcome Anna.
Hi, I'm Anna, and this is a little poem that I wrote about just the day in the life of being a Cambridge student. And each of the scenarios in this are real conversations I've had with people and things I've felt myself, so hopefully it can resonate a little bit with you. It's called Enough. 6 a.m. My alarm goes off, awakening yet another day. It's completely dark outside. The blackness echoing the feeling of waking up this early in the morning. I want to sleep, but there's only so many times the snooze button can be used. Once, twice, 3 times. A fuse for delaying an inevitable waking. And so I pedal down to the river, mind and hands numb, and my breath lingers in the air just a second too long. And the sun begins to tiptoe into the sky as I wonder why I once again try to get up so early. 7 o'clock. Into the boat. I've worked so hard. I've made that team. I've reached that dream. Yet as I push and pull on the blade, I can't help but feel that I just don't deserve it. As though I'm going to drown in the expectations of the need and the speed. And as I push on the pull on the blade, my hands begin to bleed. I long for more. When will I be enough? 8 o'clock, time to get ready. As I glance in the mirror, I see my face riddled with all of its imperfections that burden it. Each morning, opening the wardrobe, mourning the figure I yearn to have. The waste of space my waist takes up, the weight of my weight weighing down, down, down. And so the makeup goes on, and I don't recognize the mask staring back at me. A stranger. But at least that stranger fits in better than I do. When will I be enough? 10 o'clock. Tote bag in hand, walking into lectures, scanning the faces for any recognizable feature. I can't sit alone. I can't be that lonely person. Surrounded by the type of people who type frantically for the whole hour, the keys clicking as their minds clicks at the jokes and the quotes and the anecdotes that fly far over my head. When will I be enough? 11 o'clock, I walk into the library, see the columns of books, of pages of words that line each and every shelf, and my sense of self seems to fall. With every page turn, as I yearn to learn, but I cannot discern any meaning. As though each word I see, another sea of lack of understanding. That A-star student who always knew the way, weighed down, failing, trailing, with expectations that don't even have any limits. When will I be enough? Enough for who? For that sports team that want to win that race? For those people that I long to admire my face, for my studies that bring me so much pain, for my degree that I long to be first class. It will never be enough. I've always wanted more. I've seen each and every flaw. I've gone through door after door just to ignore the fact that I will never be enough. But what if it isn't me that has to be enough? What if the way after way, the day after day, I constantly seek perfection means that I'm looking in the wrong place? What if I don't have to look inside of myself, but I can look towards somebody else? What if there was someone that was living, giving, and forgiving of all my flaws? What if there was someone whose love stretches long-lasting, everlasting? One who doesn't tire or sleep, but holds me up when I feel so weak. Could there be a king of this entire earth, yet knows each and every one of us individually since birth? A real living father, an all-powerful maker, someone who's there when life becomes messy, becomes stressy. Could there be someone for when the going gets rough? Could there be a savior who really is enough? What if he's still your father when you don't win that race? What if he loves and he made your truly beautiful face? What if he knows the whole universe when those studies bring you strife? What if he doesn't need that first-class degree? He gives you eternal life. So what if, when our lives are broken, imperfect, and rough, it isn't us who have to be enough?
Thanks so much, Anna. What if we don't have to be enough because he is enough? Have you come to experience that? Some of you may well have done. Some of you may be saying, well, I'm not sure at all about these things. I've got lots of questions. And if that's you, we'll have time for questions in a moment. But some of you may be saying tonight, actually, I would love to know that. I'd love to know what it is, to know that I'm forgiven, to know that I'm enough in him, and that he is enough for me. How do I know that? How do I receive that? Well, we've talked about forgiveness tonight. Has it ever struck you there's two parts to forgiveness? We see it in human relationships too, don't we? Forgiveness can be offered, but it also needs to be received. And to receive forgiveness, we also have to recognize that we need it. It takes a degree of humility, doesn't it? I remember talking to someone once, and they'd upset or done something wrong, and I said, but I forgive you. And then they were like, why? Because you said you were sorry? They're like, oh. Because actually they weren't really sorry. Because to receive forgiveness, we have to be sorry. We have to recognize we need it. But if it's offered and received, that's when reconciliation can occur. Now, we've heard tonight that there is a God who's willing to forgive us and went to the most costly extremes to make that possible in Jesus. But the question is, are we willing to receive it? Are we willing to say, I need it, but I'm not enough, but he is? And if we are willing to do that, the wonderful thing is he is more than willing to offer that to us. So why don't you talk to this God tonight? Why not say to him, God, I'm sorry for the stuff in my life that's wrong. Maybe also I'm sorry for the way that I've tried to distract from that by pointing the finger at others rather than confronting the reality in here. Please forgive me. And he will. He'll come into your life and help you to experience that forgiveness, that fresh start, and that security that you can have from knowing a friendship with him. And that could be yours tonight.